Okay, we are ready to start. Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening to everybody. I'm really happy that quite a few of you have joined me today. So we are going to speak on quite a hot topic nowadays about ransomware, and especially about tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used by ransomware groups. And not only in 2019, but also in 2020, because we have seen quite a few changes in TTPs, but at the same time, many of the TTPs that used to be used in 2019 are still active, so we'll discuss all of this as well. My name is Oleg Sulkin. I'm Senior Digital Forensic Analyst at Group IB, and today I'll be your guide in this topic. Your microphone will be turned off automatically. So if you want to ask questions, use the form provided. Of course, after the webinar, you will receive the recording of it. So if your colleagues registered for it, but for some reason are not able to join us today, they can receive the recording and still watch it and learn something new. Our webinar will last 45 minutes. This time includes your questions, so I think we'll discuss TTPs during the first 30 or 35 minutes, and then we'll have 10 or 15 more minutes so I can answer your questions if you have any, of course. And when we get to the slide with Q&A, that's the slide where you can ask your question and the slide when I will answer them. Okay, so if you still have not downloaded our latest white paper, I worked hard on this one as well with my colleagues. So this white paper includes a lot of information about the latest methods that were used by different ransomware operators. So we'll discuss some of these techniques today during this webcast. But if you prefer reading and if you prefer more in-depth understanding of such methods, you can use this QR code, so you can download this white paper and you can walk through and get some information after the webcast, or you can even download it right now and use it during the webcast, so it may be easier to understand some things than you have a white paper in front of your eyes. So again, if you want to get the link and download the white paper, you can use the QR code that's on the current slide. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? So the whole webcast is divided in a few parts. So the first part, maybe one of the most interesting parts, is initial access. So we'll discuss how these different ransomware operators got initial access to their targets. It, of course, may be a single server, it may be the whole network, and multi-million ransom in the end. We'll discuss different cases based on our incident response experience and based on information we gathered during our cyber threat intelligence activities as well. So next, of course, then it's the whole network and not just one host or just one server. Many attackers used quite common, in fact, post-exploitation methods. and we'll discuss such methods as well. Finally, we'll look at two different groups, and we'll look at the whole cyber chain. So how did they initially access the network, how they got credentials, how they moved laterally, and finally how they deployed ransomware so they can receive or cannot. It of course depends on the company, and it depends on the size of the ransom and the availability of backups for the company, etc., etc. So finally, we'll take a look on ransomware deployment. Okay, so I think we are ready to start from our first topic. The first topic of our webcast is initial access. So as we've seen quite a lot of different groups, and these groups typically have quite a few operators. So it's not just one group, it's usually multiple groups under one roof. So tactics, techniques, and procedures may be quite different, and even inside just one group, because in fact these are multiple groups. So some of them may use quite simple techniques, but others may have quite a lot of, for example, post-exploitation frameworks like Cobalt Strike or Metasploit, etc. And they look like real APT groups, or at least some sophisticated groups. So based on this, the initial access vector usually different. So okay, let's take a look on some scenarios we've seen. So the first entry vector I want to discuss is RDP compromise. This is very, very, very common vector, just like phishing emails. We've seen them quite a lot last year. We keep seeing it this year as well, but not as much, because, for example, some actors like Shade ransomware operators, they quit and published decryption keys, and they took quite a big part of this, we can say, market of spear phishing emails to infect to infect final hosts with ransomware. So let's get back to RDP. So this is quite a classic initial access vector. There are quite a lot of servers that are accessible from the outside world via RDP, especially nowadays when we are still in pandemic times. So more and more companies need remote access to their infrastructure, and not all the companies have experienced security analysts. Some companies even don't have security analysts at all. So system administrators typically use RDP, so they can access network. So some of the employees can access network, and in many cases we observed it's not very secure. For example, there is no whitelisting, there is no multi-factor authentication, or what is more, usually passwords for accounts are quite simple, and in many cases even standard account, that is administrator account, is available, and this allowed attackers, even not very sophisticated attackers, very easily gain access to at least one server that is exposed to the internet, or even compromise the whole network. And there are many groups that use this for initial access vector, from not very sophisticated, for example, Derma ransomware, that is also known as Crisis. And there is another family that is quite similar to Derma, is Phobos, that those operators also use this entry vector very often. And they are not very sophisticated. So usually they get access to the server. They then use typical tools like Mimikatz to get more accounts, and they use the same remote desktop protocol to move laterally through the network and try to understand where they are. So what amount of ransom they can get from this network, and usually they just encrypt one server that was initially accessed, or they may move laterally using the same RDP and just drop ransomware on every server that they can compromise. So nothing sophisticated, just simple brute force attack, then network scanning, then using the same obtained credentials to move laterally, and that's all. And ransomware deployment usually by hand. But there are some other threat actors that are much more sophisticated. For example, Revil. This group used quite a lot of different initial access vectors. We'll discuss many of them on the further slides, but this group used RDP as initial entry, as initial access vector as well. So we've seen quite a lot of cases, not only for Revil, but for Maze and for many other quite sophisticated groups, because these groups, as I already mentioned, these groups consist of different subgroups, and depend on the subgroup, TTPs may be quite different. So some use exploits, some use spear phishing, some use exploit kits, while others may use such common initial access vectors as RDP compromise. Okay, let's go further. So drive-by. Again, as many ransomware operators, they are partners for so-called ransomware as a service programs. And as there are quite a few ransomware as a service programs, we can see very different initial access vector, including exploit kits. Of course, exploit kits nowadays are not very efficient, but anyway, they are used from year to year, and they still quite successfully used to infect just average people workstation. So typically, these exploit kits used in campaigns that target not enterprise, some enterprise companies, but just an enterprise network, but just regular users. And if we look at vulnerabilities that are used, it's usually Internet Explorer and Macromedia Flash. So this web browser and its components are not widely used in the enterprise. So again, you can understand from this that usually this is about regular users. And if we are talking about recent trends, this year exploit kits are not used that often as previous year, because This year, most of ransomware as a service programs, they prefer targeting enterprises, because targeting enterprises, they can receive quite a huge amount of money as a ransom, because unfortunately, usually regular users can't afford to pay even $500,000. So that's why they are not. That's why nowadays they are not targeted that often as previous year. So next entry vector is phishing. This vector is very popular, not only from ransomware operators' perspective, but from malware distribution in general. Many groups nowadays use Trojans as initial entry vectors. So it started in 2018 with Rook ransomware. So Rook operators used Emotet to deliver TrickBot. Then they used TrickBot to move laterally, to harvest credential, and to get access to the network, and to run different post-exploitation frameworks like PowerShell Empire, Cobalt Strike, etc. So they can compromise the whole network and successfully, and they can gain domain admin credentials, they can compromise the main controller, and they can use the main controller to finally distribute ransomware. Nowadays, we see quite a few groups that use similar kill chain and similar initial entry vector. For example, recently we've seen quite a few cases involving QBot. So it's just like with Rook. QBot is used as initial entry vector and for post-exploitation together with many post-exploitation frameworks like Cobalt Strike, for example. And finally, this group deploys Prolog ransomware. Recently, we released a blog post on Prolog, so if you're interested in learning more about this ransomware family and about its connection with QBot, you can check our blog at groupib.com. Also, in a few weeks, we are planning to release another white paper about the same ransomware strain, about Prolog and about QBot, that will contain in-depth analysis of everything related to these campaigns. There is a few more examples. One more group that involved in big game hunting is double paymer. Double paymer operators usually use Dridex Trojan to get initial access to the network and again to move laterally. So double paymer is a fork of another very famous ransomware family called that's called BitPaymer. By the way, we've seen a few cases back in 2019 that BitPaymer was distributed the same way as Rook. So initial access was Emotet, then TrickBot dropped, moving laterally, Cobalt Strike, and then finally they dropped not Rook but BitPaymer. And the last group I want to talk about that also use Trojans as initial entry vector is Clop. Clop ransomware operators you have connections with the TA505, and we've seen that campaigns that distributed SDB bot, followed by downloading of TinyMet, then Metasploit Cobalt Strike, and finally Club ransomware deployment. So as you can see, there are quite a few groups nowadays that use similar tactics, techniques, and procedures, and they're quite dangerous. And usually they ask a few hundreds of thousands of dollars for ransom, and they usually target huge enterprises and not regular users or small or medium business. Of course, such groups are not the only groups that use phishing emails to distribute ransomware. For example, last year we've seen a lot of incidents, not only in Russia but also in the United States, in Japan, in Singapore, that involved shade ransomware. So shade ransomware is quite interesting. Nowadays, it's no more active. They recently released all decryption keys, so they are out of business. But last year they were quite active, and they use spear phishing emails to deliver their ransomware. So it's usually GS files in an archive or a PDF file with a link. If you click the link, then the same archive will be downloaded. You can open it and run GS file, and then shade ransomware will be downloaded from C2 and run. And also why it is quite interesting, because it may download additional modules. So first module it's typically downloaded was cryptocurrency miner, and the second module was CMS brute forcer. Because why did they need such kind of brute forcer? Because this group used compromised WordPress websites to store their payload that are downloaded by those JS scripts. So they sent millions of spear phishing emails. So that's why they got quite a few victims. But it's not all. Not only spear phishing emails were used to deliver ransomware. There are some other entry vectors which involved phishing as well. For example, the same operators that use Dridex and then deployed double payment, they used another technique, another interesting technique. So they compromised websites, and these websites demonstrated users that their browsers, for example Firefox or Google Chrome, are out of date, and these compromised websites allowed them to download an update. But in fact, the file that was downloaded by the victim, it was a JS or HTA file, and once this file was run by the user, Dridex was downloaded to the victim machine. And so if the machine was a domain machine, this may be the first step of the whole enterprise compromise. So quite interesting. So it may even look like a pseudo supply chain attack, because from user's perspective, it looked like it was a legitimate browser update, but in fact, user just visited compromised website. And one more thing, another ransomware family that was quite active last year is Stop ransomware family, and this ransomware family used cracked software for distribution. So if the users wanted to download some cracked version of Photoshop, for example, or a crack for some commercial programs, they got to malicious website, downloaded it, but in fact it wasn't a crack or piece of software. They installed Stop ransomware instead. As I already mentioned, some groups used quite advanced initial entry vectors. Because there are different groups under one roof, again, as I already mentioned, and Revil is one of such groups. In fact, this group has 5 slots. So at one moment, there can be 5 individuals or 5 groups that will be partners of this program. So they can get ransomware from Ransomware as a Service program and use their own distribution methods, their own, for example, specialists or in pen testing or red teaming for post-exploitation, and they pay some part of the ransom they get to Ransomware as a Service program organizer. And some of these program affiliates used quite interesting initial access vector. For example, one of the groups behind Revil compromised Italian version of WinRAR website. So in fact, it was a distributor, an Italian distributor of WinRAR. So they compromised their website and they weaponized WinRAR installer. And instead of installing WinRAR on the victims' machines, this installer ran Revil ransomware. Again, this attack, despite its sophistication, wasn't against corporations. So this attack was against regular users, but it was quite effective, and initial entry vector was very interesting. So next, exploiting public-facing applications. I think if you are doing incident response like me, I'm sure you've seen and I'm sure you've heard and you know every vulnerability that is presented on the slides, especially PulseSecure VPN vulnerability. We've seen a lot of incidents where this vulnerability was exploited and to gain initial foothold to the network. There are still quite a few of servers that are vulnerable, and unfortunately we keep seeing a lot of attacks that used this vulnerability, and we keep seeing. Hope everybody will patch against all of this, and maybe it will make the life of ransomware operators a bit harder, but in fact they usually find more and more initial entry vectors, so we will still keep seeing them. And again, it's about Revil. I'm sure you've seen quite a few of such attacks. Some of the affiliates compromised managed service providers, and this allowed them to use legitimate remote access software like ASEA to access to the networks of their clients and to deploy ransomware, to deploy PowerShell scripts that were used to download and execute real ransomware. It's quite interesting to point here that Revil and GenCrab have some similarities in the code of the ransomware families, and also before Revil affiliates compromised some MSPs, the only group that used the same technique for initial access was GenCrab. So again, this may be still the same group, or at least some affiliates from GenCrab are now affiliates of Revil ransomware. Okay, so not all the groups targeted just one server or just some computers of regular users. Many ransomware operators, especially nowadays, especially in 2020, they target huge enterprise networks. So if you are targeting enterprise network, you must be able to perform some post-exploitation activities. And it's not enough for you to compromise just one host, one server. So, of course, you need to get credentials. Still, we see that Mimikatz and Lasagne are quite often used to get credentials. Of course, Mimikatz have lots of variations. So we've seen invoke Mimikatz and different builds of Mimikatz were used by different operators, but still it's effective and it can be used to gain credentials. If you're talking about Lasagne, this tool allows not only to gain credentials for Windows, but also it allowed to get credentials for many other applications, for example, for email, for passwords that are saved in web browsers, etc. And as already been said, many groups use Trojans. So, for example, if you're dealing with TrickBot or CubeBot, in it, both Trojans have capabilities to obtain credentials as well. Next, when you got credentials, you should map network, execute some scripts remotely, etc., and understand what is the network. You can obtain some backdoors, etc. And many groups used different post-exploitation framework. Of course, most popular were Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, and PowerShell Empire. Many groups used it, from Revil to Rook. Some Revil affiliates also used CrabMap exec, and in a few cases, but still we've seen both of these, it were Bosch, C2, and Codic. So I think many companies hire pen testers or red teamers and use this to improve their detections. So it's very important to understand if you can detect the usage of such post-exploitation frameworks, because in many cases attackers just disabled antivirus software, and once antivirus software was disabled, they can just use very simple and very generic stages and beacons, and this software were not detected because antivirus software was disabled. Or for example, again, if companies hired pen testers or had their own pen testers or red teamers in the company, and they got used to such tools on their network, they may miss the usage of such tools, thinking that red teamers use this tool. So it's very important to differentiate these tools from your own pen testers or red teamers, or hired pen testers or red teamers, and pen testers or red teamers that are a part of ransomware distribution groups. Again, as quite common Trojans and post-exploitation frameworks were used, we've seen quite common persistence mechanisms. Of course, valid accounts, because as already been said, valid accounts may be obtained during initial access, and these accounts may have enough privileges to move laterally and do everything in the domain. And other common persistence mechanisms like run keys, startup folders, scheduled tasks, creation of new services, and again, post-exploitation frameworks allowed some attackers to use more sophisticated persistence mechanisms, for example, WMI event subscription. Again, this mechanism wasn't used very often, but again, we've seen a few cases. Lateral movement and ransomware deployment. Those groups which were not very sophisticated, they typically used remote desktop protocol to deploy ransomware, so they did it manually. Many groups used PSExec or PSExec and WMIC, so they used WMIC to copy a piece of ransomware to the host they needed to be, and they used PSExec to execute all the same WMIC to execute it on remote hosts. More sophisticated groups, for example, I'm sure you've heard about Icans ransomware that targeted OT networks as well. This group typically use group policy to distribute its ransomware, and also they usually name the ransomware payload like Windows Update or something like this, so it looks legitimate. Of course, many other groups used group policy modification as well, like Rook, Revil, Maze, and many others. Another thing that was introduced in 2019 and keeps going nowadays is data exfiltration. So as you can see on the screenshot, Maze created even a cattle, and nowadays they collect and publish data from other groups. For example, here on the screenshot, you can see that they got some data from Regna operators. Also, previously, they published data gathered by operators of Logbit ransomware. Again, as there are quite a few ransomware as a service programs, so some pen testers or operators may change from one partner program to another. That's why then many of them may be interconnected. On one hand, it makes the life of companies much harder because the data exfiltrated will be published, and the company may have quite a lot of problems with its reputation. But at the same time, as usually they exfiltrate quite a lot of data. For example, as you can see on the screenshot, is more than 500 gigabytes exfiltrated. So as this thing is done before ransomware deployment, if your systems have good detection rate for data exfiltration, you may understand that you are compromised before ransomware deployment, so you can stop the incident at this point. And finally, let's look at two different kill chains. So the first kill chain is quite simple. It's derma ransomware. So usually it's exposed server that's accessible via RDP, and they access this server via a brute force attack. So once they access the server successfully, they used quite typical tools like Mimikatz. They just drop it to the host, to the desktop of the host, and so they run it and potentially can gain more credentials. They move laterally via RDP, the same, so they typically don't use many post-exploitation tools. They may use something like advanced IP scanner or advanced network scanner to understand which hosts are accessible via RDP, and then move laterally and deploy ransomware manually. So the kill chain is quite simple. But let's look at another kill chain. So, and this is Prolog. So Prolog has already been set. We are going to release a white paper and already have a post on the blog. So if you want to learn more about it, you're welcome. So initial access vector is a phishing email with QBot. Usually it's a VBS script in an archive. So once it's run, a QBot is downloaded. So it has capabilities to obtain credentials, or some other tools like Mimikatz or Lazan can be dropped as well. To move laterally, again, RDP is used. They also have some scripts to enable FTP remotely, and they heavily used, for some reason, they heavily use PSExec. So we've seen that they use PSExec to enable RDP. We've seen they use PSExec to start Cobalt Strike stages on many hosts, just running a bat file on remote hosts. And we have even seen that the group distributed QBot using PSExec. So they just had loader and they used PSExec to distribute it through the network. So it means that most likely they are tightly connected with QBot operators. Maybe it's not the same group, because, for example, we've seen then when they initially accessed the network, they used Bloodhound to gather information about the Active Directory. But before deployment of ransomware, they used another tool, that is AdFind, to collect information again. So potentially these were different operators, but maybe they just used different tools because they changed their toolkit, because initial access was a month before the actual deployment. And so we're talking about deployment, they use WMI, and a very interesting thing, they use BITS jobs to download Prolog executables from remote servers. And executables themselves are quite interesting, because it's a shellcode that is obtained from a JPEG file, from BMP file, and recently we've seen CSV files as well that are used. And the ransomware itself is working from PowerShell process. Okay, here you can see MITRE ATT&CK heat map that is composed from tactics and techniques we observed in 2019. The same attack mapping, attack heat map, can be found in the white paper. So if you want to check it thoroughly, you can download the white paper and get all information you need from it. So I'm ready to start answering your question, but before it, we have a special offer for you. As you may know, we offer instant response retainer, and if you use this QR code from the slide, you will get 2 free months for yearly subscription. So this offer will be valid for a few more months. So make sure you save the QR code someday, and if you decide and if you think that you need our help in instant response, we'll be happy, and you are welcome to use this unique offer to get 2 free months. Okay, so if you have any questions regarding ransomware groups or regarding anything I told you, I'm really happy to answer. So the first question, suppose we have infected with ransomware, what is best and simple way to decrypt our data? So if we are talking about some advanced attackers like Revil, Maze, Doppelpaymer, Rook, etc., unfortunately, there is no way to decrypt data if you don't have proper backups. So the only way to get your data back is to obtain the key from attackers, and to do it, you will have to pay. Of course, we do not recommend paying the ransom, but again, in some cases, this is the only way to get your data back. So make sure you have a proper backing up system. So any other questions? Okay, now the question, how to prevent such attacks? Maybe you have some products to help with it. Of course, we have different products, and many companies have some great products to prevent different attacks, including ransomware attacks. But unfortunately, not a single product can protect you from any attack, including ransomware. You also need to have some good specialists that can help you to work on these products and to understand then something really bad is detected. For example, even antivirus software, many people just see some detections and think that, okay, it's detected, it's deleted, so I don't need to do anything about it. But in fact, of course, if you've seen some detections in some not very common places like data, like some temp folders or system32, etc., etc., you should at least try to understand where this malicious sample got to this location, because it may be one of the latest parts of cyber kill chain, and maybe you already compromised for quite a long time, and it may help you to prevent from ransomware deployment, for example. Another question, do you have related educational courses for specialists? Of course we have. We have different programs, from classic digital forensics that can help you to get as much information as possible from potentially compromised hosts and understand what happened, what this incident is about. But also we have courses for SOC analysts, we have courses for malware analysts. So you can check our website, and we have quite a few educational programs, and most of our incident response specialists are involved from time to time to check these programs. So a big part of the materials are from the guys in the fields. Can someone trace these groups? Of course, our cyber threat intelligence unit do it. And you can do it too, of course. So again, it's very hard and almost impossible to track these groups till the human behind them. But to collect information about them, to understand their tactics, techniques, and procedures that can help you to prevent such attacks in your environment. You can do it, of course. You can use different cyber threat intelligence feeds and cyber threat intelligence providers, or at least read blogs, read white papers and articles from different vendors. There are quite a few nowadays, especially during pandemic. So you can learn quite a lot of information from it that can be really, really helpful to protect your environment. Another question, do we see any change in ransomware trends, tactics during the current pandemic situation? Yes, we see. So again, talking about Prolog, there was a very interesting attack we investigated recently. So this attack involved a home computer. So a person worked from home, and his or her computer was infected with a Q-bot. And this person used VPN to get access to internal network of the company. And unfortunately, this finally led to enterprise deployment of Prolog. So as many people use their home computers or just work from home using their office laptops. So unfortunately, sometimes this lead to such huge incidents. And now the question, can you share an average time from initial compromise until ransomware deployment? How much does this vary from group to group? In fact, it varies a lot because some groups are not very sophisticated, and then they get access to initial server, for example, where exploiting a vulnerability or where a brute force attack against RDP. They may deploy ransomware the same day or the next day, but then they're talking about incidents, then some Trojans involved, like U-bot, like Emotet and Trick bot, SDB bot, etc. Usually, this attack are from 10 days to 30 days. So this can be quite a long period of time. Again, some attacks may last even longer, and we've seen an incident that took place 8 months. So the dwell time was 8 months, and only after they finally deployed. By the way, it was Rook. As a SIRT analyst, what practices are mandatory to detect ransomware? In fact, you, especially as a SIRT analyst, you must not detect ransomware. You must detect tactics and techniques that used before ransomware deployment, because then it's already deployed, there is nothing to do. So you should prevent such attacks. So learn as much as possible about attackers' tactic, techniques, and procedures, and try to hunt in your network and check your detections for related alerts. That's the key knowledge that you need to detect and prevent such attacks. Okay, thanks a lot for attending. It was a great time talking about it. Thanks a lot. Bye.